Well, let's just consider how much they were. I mean, we've covered some of this. Let me just summarise where we seem to be. A year after the invasion, at the moment, the coalition is unable to provide security for the Iraqi people. And you've indicated without security, life can't get better. Mm-hmm. Infrastructure is blown up. Life of people deteriorate. Services aren't any good. You can't develop the economy. And that feeds in to an awful situation. Now, for the Iraqi people at this time, things are not getting better. Is that fair to say? If you look at the promises that have been made to them, they might have some grounds for disillusionment with the coalition. I just want to give you some figures because I find them tragic. We're in January 2010 now. These are just January monthly figures for documented civilian deaths from violence in Iraq. 570 in January 2004, 1,042 in January 2005, 1,433 in January 2006, 2,807 in January 2007. These are monthly figures. These are the documented deaths. They're not the, goodness knows how many, undocumented. They're not the deaths from the deterioration in services, poverty, poor health, and so on. The striking thing is they're getting worse each year. Mm-hmm. What did you feel at the time that you could do about this? What could you say to the Iraqi people that could explain what they must have felt, a sense of letdown at what the coalition had been able to do for them?
What we did with the Iraqi people is to say, first of all, we're going to carry on with the political process, because for the first time you've actually been able to elect your government and your officials. You're drawing up a constitution in a proper and decent way. The second thing was to say, we're going to be with you and we're going to help you defeat this. And the third thing to say, and this is immensely important to this whole argument, when people say there were people dying in Iraq, and you know the figures, I think the most reliable figures out of the Iraq body count or the Brookings Institute are maybe 100,000 over this whole period. The coalition forces weren't the ones doing the killing. The ones doing the killing were the terrorists, the sectarians, and they were doing it quite deliberately to stop us making the progress we wanted to make. So my attitude, and I took this line very, very strongly with people, when we say, isn't it terrible that the death toll went to 2007 that high? Yes, it is terrible. But the first question to ask is, who is killing them? And this turned out to be precisely the same people that we were trying to fight everywhere. And our responsibility was to stick in there and see it through, which eventually happened with the surge, with the charge of the Knights down in Basra. And today, of course, the situation in Iraq is very, very different. And the people are better off and have a decent chance of a proper future.
Let us hope so. But let me just...
Well, I think that's the evidence that was given to you by John Jenkins.
Certainly better off than they were in 2007.
Or in 2003, or 2, or 1.
I think, having just had some conversations with Iraqis, I think that's something that has to be shown. But I don't want to get into that. We can agree and hope that the position for ordinary Iraqis only improves. Can I just go back to this question of responsibility? And there's no doubt that this was not British troops killing Iraqi civilians. This was violence on a major scale. But isn't it, to some extent, to a considerable extent, our responsibility if we've gone into a country initially as an occupying power and then unable to provide the basics of security? Let me just, this is evidence that we got from General Sharif describing the situation as he found it in May 2006. The single battalion commander responsible for a city of 1.3 million people told me that he could put no more than 13 half platoons or multiples on the ground, less than 200 soldiers on the ground. You compare that with what I recall as a young platoon commander in West Belfast in the late 1970s, when there was a brigade on the ground. The result of all of that was what I call a cycle of insecurity, and goes on to make the points we've made before. So that was May 2006, and his basic description was that the militias had filled the gap that we had left.
And by May 2009, that is a different situation. And why? Because we then built up the capacity of the Iraqi forces themselves. Actually, in the end, the British, I think, were particularly with the Iraqi 10th Division. In the end, we managed, and if it hadn't been for the British forces down in Basra, making sure that we were acting and helping keep this at bay the entire time, the Charge of the Knights would never have worked. But it did in the end. And if you talk to people about Basra today, there are real improvements there now. And it's a completely different situation in security. Likewise in the rest of Iraq. In the end, we did stick with them. And I agree with you, it's our responsibility. But here's the point that I think we've got to get ourselves into in the Western world, if I can put it like this, or when we're doing these types of operations. Yes, it is our responsibility. But let's be quite clear why we face the difficulty. We face the difficulty because these people were prepared to go and kill any number of completely innocent people in suicide bombings, because as you know, in the first half of 2004, I think we had 30. In the first half of 2005, that then went up to 200. We should be prepared to take these people on. And the fact that they're prepared to act like this should not be a reason for our not being there or fighting them.
I want to conclude, because there's other questions that need to be posed to you. I suppose the final question is, this was a very heavy price to pay, was it not, for the lack of preparation and the perhaps cavalier attitude to planning taken perhaps more in the United States than in the United Kingdom in 2003?
We certainly didn't take a cavalier attitude to planning in the UK. What we planned for was what we thought was going to happen. But, and you will consider this, but I just give you my view of this, because otherwise I think we'll make a mistake in future such situations. However much you plan, and whatever forces you have, if you have these elements, AQ on the one side, Iran on the other, who are prepared to destabilize, you are going to be in a tough, long drawn out, difficult situation. But my point is very simple. The fact that these people, in breach of not just the rules of international law but humanity, are prepared to do these terrible things in order to frustrate the will of the Iraqi people should not mean we back away from confronting them. We should be there with the Iraqi people, alongside them, as we did and were in the end, in order to make sure that having been released from Saddam, they were then released from the reign of terror. And I mean, I too speak to Iraqis, and I spoke to one just a few days back who said to me, we have changed the certainty of repression for the uncertainty of democratic politics. He says it's difficult and challenging, but the progress is extraordinary. And nobody would want to go back to the days when they had no freedom and no opportunity and no hope. So I understand what you're saying, but and we do have to take our responsibility seriously in these situations, but we're in exactly the same situation now in Afghanistan, and heaven knows where we'll be in the same situation again in the future. And the lesson out of it, in my view, is you've got to be prepared for the long haul, and you've got to be prepared to stick it through until the end.
The long haul started in 2003.
It did start in 2003, but I posed the 2010 question earlier, and I would pose it again.